As you're joining our Zoom live webinar here, feel free to open up the chat in the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you should see a little chat bubble. If you open that up, there's a spot on the side where you can introduce yourself if you like, say hello. Feel free to share where you're joining us from, and if there's anything in particular you're hoping to learn today, feel free to type that in there as well, and we'll all be able to see it. We're going to wait just a minute here while we let some other attendees join us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, Steve is starting us off in the chat. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
All right, and Neil as well. Welcome. Greetings to everyone.
Hello.
Right. We've got quite a number of people here. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to keep introducing yourself in the chat box if you haven't already and you'd like to say hello. You can tell us your name, where you're joining us from, and if there's something in particular you're hoping to learn during our webinar today, feel free to put that in the chat box as well. So hello again, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm a program manager at North House Folk School. And though I'm at my home today, I'm missing campus and all of you, but excited to be able to connect in this way and to be able to learn a little bit together today on this live webinar. So thanks so much for joining us. This, of course, is a new adventure and a new format for North House, so we welcome your feedback and thoughts as we go along about how this is working for you and if there are ways we can improve things. So we love to have community events at North House where people can learn about all different kinds of things, and just because we're all sheltered in our homes right now, the learning doesn't have to stop. So welcome to this one of many ways that we're continuing our Crafting in Place series, and instructors are sharing tidbits about craft from all over the place in many different formats. Today I'm joined by a couple of my coworkers, and I'll let them introduce themselves. First, Justice is going to share a bit about Zoom. Go ahead, Justice.
Hey everyone, so my name is Justice. I'm the technology manager at North House, and I'm just going to say a couple quick things about how Zoom is going to work during this webinar. So down at the bottom of your screen, you should have a couple options. You should have a Q&A option, a raise hand option, and also a chat option. If you have any questions at any point during the webinar, if you want to type your question in, you can type it into the Q&A box, and we will have Josh will answer it. Otherwise, if you want to ask your question live, you can click the raise hand button, and then we will unmute you, and you can talk to us. But either way, however you do it, we'll hold the questions first for the end of the video that Josh is going to present. So we'll have a question period at the end of the video, and then Josh will talk a little bit, and we'll have another question period when Josh is done talking. So feel free to raise your hand or type in that Q&A box at any time, but just know that we'll address those questions when we get to the question period. And then the chat box is just a good place to share comments that you don't necessarily need an answer to. So with that being said, I'll turn things over to Josh. He'll introduce himself. We'll watch the video of him building the cedar-strip canoe, which is about 18 minutes, and then we'll come back on for a little bit more discussion. Go ahead, Josh.
Hi. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming, guys. I'm building the cedar-strip canoe right now. It's a fundraiser for the local Chamber of Commerce, but I wanted to share it as part of the Crafting in Place initiative. Kind of talk about how I'm doing it. It's not a super difficult project. Cedar-strip canoes are somewhat accessible to a novice woodworker, but right now I'm in sort of a fiberglass and sanding and sort of loud dusty phase of the project. So I made a video a week ago to show you guys what I was working on then, which is a little bit more interesting carpentry part of the project. So we'll show you guys that, and then I'll give you a little update as to what's going on with the boat right now. Yeah, so I hope you guys like it. So yeah, go ahead, Justin.
All right.
for that. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. I'll start the video. And if anyone has any problem hearing or seeing the video, just let us know in the chat box. Give us just a second here while I get this queued up.
All right, I'm building the cedar-strip canoe here in the North House ADP studio, and this is going to be for the local Chamber of Commerce, the Cook County Chamber of Commerce. It's going to be like raffled off in their summer fundraiser. But I thought I'd just kind of show you guys what's involved with putting a strip on a cedar-strip canoe. It's a multi-step process. I'm using square edge strips. Some people buy bead and cove strips that have like a bead on one side and a cove on the other narrow edge, and that helps lock the strips together a little bit easier. But I make my own straight-sided strips, which is a little cheaper and not that much harder, and it's actually kind of more fun in my opinion. The other thing is that right now I'm starting to do this pattern down the center line, which is like a herringbone kind of pattern, and so this will sort of continue this back and forth zigzag all the way down the center of the boat. So that kind of starts once you get right around this turn of the stem where the boat kind of starts to become flat. You can kind of see, like, after this one, I started herringboning, whereas down in the lower part of the boat, you just run all the strips off the stem. So, yeah. Let's see, I'll just walk around some of the tools that I have here. Stapler, I'm stapling all these strips down. There's some other ways to do it, but stapling is sort of the quickest and, like, most known way. Little block plane. And a couple chisels I keep handy, just for trimming things. I've got this pointy chisel that I made from an old chisel that I got at an auction, and just a normal chisel here. Those things, and then up here I have this little jig that I made. It's just a small miter box that is the perfect size for a strip to go into, and so this allows me to just cut perfectly 90-degree cut on strips. So I've got that, and I kind of use the backside for other cutting. And I use it with this little small-sized Japanese dovetail saw, which is a pull saw, and little straight edge, and a little razor blade. So the first thing I do when I do this is I'm trying to get it to fit first into this herringbone, so I need to cut an angle like this onto the edge of this. And the way I do that is I start by finding this point where the previous strip has the sort of top edge touching the strip on this side. And I put a little mark there so I can see it easier. And then I hold my strip in the right attitude where it needs to live, and I take that little mark there and I transfer that straight up. So that's a mark there, and then I come over here and I find that point right there where the other edge is meeting the other edge, kind of. And I bring that up, and then I take my little short straight edge and I come to my little work surface here, and I will connect that point and that point with my little short straight edge, and then I take my little razor blade and I go over that a couple times to kind of score that line, because it's not an easy line to cut. And it'd be nice if it was the same every time. I could make a jig for it, but it's always a different angle, so I kind of have to scribe it every time. And then I
I don't think everyone does it like this, but I kind of come in at an angle and just take a little wedge off of this, like that with my razor blade. And that just gives me a little place for my saw to live. And then I'll just finish this cut with the saw. And you could probably do this whole cut with a razor blade, just kind of pushing through. It's only a 1/4 inch thick. But this seems to be the method that I like. Okay. So now we'll bring that to the end and see how it fits. That's actually pretty good. There's two things going on here. One is that I'm still on my stem on this side, and eventually, so this stem is a little bent piece of wood that in the front of the boat, all of the strips land on to give them support. And once you get past the stem, it's always a little bit easier to get this thing closed up a little bit. So it's more like that. But right now, this bottom edge is resting on the stem a little bit, holding things up. So I do two things here. One is I'll take my little pointy chisel, and I'll just kind of get in there a little bit and shave the stem down right in that area where this plank is going to land. Try to create a slightly flatter landing for that. And that will help that a little bit. And then the other thing that I do is I take the strip over to my table, workbench, and I'm just going to put, I use this block plane for this, not totally sure. You could use a smaller plane, but I just put a little bevel on this edge of the plank, and that will also help the plank sort of not stick up like that. You can see already it's making a much tighter seam there. So, plus I can put a staple right on that, and that will help hold it down like I did there. So that might be okay for now. Then the next thing I do is I kind of pre-bend this into its place. This is the trickiest part of this. And I'm walking down the boat as I sort of bend this into its place. And I do this kind of to get the light. And I always make sure that I have my pencil in my ear or in my shirt when I'm doing this, and I'm going to need to make a mark. So I'm holding this in place, trying to get the perfect length. That's okay. And I'm walking along, and I see that the strip is going to break on this little frame or mold, station mold. So I'll put a little mark in the middle of that station mold. And then I will take my little miter box that I made here, put the strip into it, and I'm going to cut a perfect 90-degree angle right where that mark is. So that way the strip will end right here, and you can see the way we do this is we just have 90-degree butt joints 90 on all the strips, and that's how we join them together. It's not really a strong joint, but this is just for aesthetics, because these strips are going to get covered in fiberglass, and that's what's going to make it strong. The last thing to do is I have these little cutouts that I've made to support the strip, so I can just bring these over to this side of the boat, so they're a little in a better working position. I just clamp them into place, and I put the strip in them like that. And this is one of the last strips that's going to need a bevel, but I was talking before about how some people use a bead and cove, get bead and cove strips to lock these strips together. Since I don't do that, I have to put a little bevel on this part of the plank, and that allows the planks to sort of close there and not have a seam, not have a gap on the outside edge of the seam. And I just use these little cheap thumb planes to do that. And right now you can see the boat right here where I'm almost to the end of where I need to put the bevel on. Once I get closer to the middle of the boat's really flat here, and you kind of stop having to do the bevel. But especially like down in this part of the boat, I had to put a lot of bevel on these planks to get them to sort of sit pretty tight. So this one I'll do a light bevel, so it's just a couple passes, and I just kind of go along with my little thumb plane. Now the reason I use these sort of small planes here is because they're easier to use in a way. But when I was doing that end grain and planing on that angle on the tip of the plank, the strip, I used my low angle block plane because it's easier to sharpen that blade. And when you're working on the end grain of the wood, I like to have a really sharp blade. And these cheap planes, these little fingered planes are handy, but they never are quite as sharp, and so I don't like to use them on the end grain. I use that bigger plane on the end grain. I'll just do one more here. Great. So now I'll kind of double check everything, make sure it looks good. Probably could hit that a little bit more, but it's making a pretty nice seam all the way along the length, so I think it's going to be good. At this point, sometimes I just use a little block of wood with sandpaper. Is another thing that I'll do. If you don't have a block plane and you want to work on this end grain, just do that. It's a good way to sort of touch up your sharp ends of the board here. But I think that will help me get this a little bit more flush in there. Now I'll glue it down and staple it down. So take glue. This is sort of the stupid part. Here it comes, I think. Yeah, great. Okay. Then it's good practice to take a little piece of wood and flatten out your glue. I'll admit I don't always do this, but since I'm demonstrating, I'll use best practice. And if you have like irregular spots like here where you have these little beads, this will help have your glue joint be a little cleaner. The other thing I want to do is make sure you get a little glue right on the stem and in on this mating surface of the other plank. You have a nice amount of glue on the stem there. And you take your stapler, and I've learned through trial and error that the best stapler to do this with is the just the old Arrow T90 stapler, which is the stapler that you see in most hardware stores. But there's a lot of new staplers on the market that are like heavy duty, they say like heavy duty or extra strength, and they are too powerful for this application because this stapler leaves the staples just flush or even a little proud sometimes, and those really strong staplers will just sink the staple deep into the wood, and it will make pulling them out a pain in the butt. And this gets trickier and trickier as you go to the middle of the boat. These pieces of wood are sort of taking this curve, which looks really cool, but it's hard to, you have to muscle them into this curve a little bit. Let's go. And then I go back to the tip. I usually like it's too hard. There's too much muscle I'm trying to do to get the tip in the beginning, so I kind of go back and do that last. Uh-oh. I think I probably just ran out of staples, but you can imagine there's a staple there, and that'll be good. So that's all. Thanks, guys.
Great.
All right. I know I enjoyed that. I hope you all did too. And we have some awesome questions here, so I'm going to relay them to you, Josh. And Josh, you can answer them if that works for you.
Yeah, that's
So
great. I saw some of those pop in, so I have a few comments. But yeah, well, maybe you should just kind of go through them in an orderly fashion. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sounds good. So Joey Ford is wondering what the most economical per cedar board that you found is.
Yeah, you know, it's hard to find economical cedar. It's expensive. You know, you can go to Menards and pick through the pile and try to find clear ones. One thing, you know, is like thinking about the trade-off between making wider strips, which are going to be harder to shape, or using narrower strips, which maybe isn't always the most efficient use of lumber. You know, sometimes I've seen people use cedar decking for this. Decking is often sold at like 5/4 inches, like for a cedar deck, instead of 3/4 inches, which is what this is. But the 5/4 inch stuff will make an okay boat too. You just have to, you know, do a little bit more beveling on each plank because you're going around like a less dramatic surface. this boat, I'm using Alaskan yellow cedar, which I have a place on the West Coast that I buy it from. It's just a small lumber yard on like the Olympic Peninsula where I went to boat building school that mostly sells construction grade lumber, and they sell Alaskan yellow cedar super cheap as fence posts, which is something you can do out there where there's a lot of Alaskan yellow cedar. I just buy like 4x4 fence posts from them. They ship them across the country for me, and I saw them just strips from a fence post. If you're really trying to save money, another thing you can do is, the two things about cedar that are nice are its rot resistance and it's very low weight. So another species of wood that we have a lot better access to locally in the Midwest that has one of those qualities, it's very low weight, is basswood. And basswood does not have rot resistance, but if you do a really good job just fiberglassing your boat and making sure you stay on top of scratches and stuff into the cedar as you use it, a basswood strip boat could be a great canoe. Yeah.
And then a related question, Josh, also from...
What's that?
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, Joey asked a related question too. Do you cut your cedar strips down on a table saw then?
Yeah, I have cut my own cedar strips on a table saw, and I've cut them myself before. And then Ken Kosick told me I should rip them on with like a gang rip system. So when I cut the strips for this boat, I put 2 blades on my table saw arbor, sort of like a dado, but instead of having like, dado stack where you have, like 4 blades across, I put my 1 blade on, and then I got some big washers and I spaced out enough so that I could have exactly a 1/4 inch space between the 2 saw blades, put the second blade on, and then put the nut on. I had just enough room on my standard table saw arbor to do that. And then when you do that, 2 things, you have to really pay attention to the actual distance between the 2 tooths on the blade, because the table saw blade, those carbide tip tooths are actually wider than the blade themselves. So the spacer has to actually be wider than a 1/4 inch because you have to account for the width of those teeth. And then also, then you have to make sure that the space between the fence and the first blade is that exact same distance as the distance between the 2 blades, so that when you're pushing a board through, you get 2 exactly the same strips off of a board. So that saves you a lot of time, because there's about 60 strips you need to cut at least for a boat. Yeah.
And then Steve Krause was wondering where the boat form is from.
The boat form is my original shape. I designed it myself. I started from, I started with some lines of other canoes that I knew about, and I drew a few kind of control lines. I drew the shear line of the boat from another boat that I knew, and I kind of used a rocker across the bottom. That's a pretty standard, I think it's 2.5 inches over the length of the boat, which is kind of a standard rocker. So I used that, and then I started making my own shape, which is something that, if you are interested in boat lofting, you can design it yourself. It's not a fast process. It probably took me 2 or 3 weeks to fully get the patterns developed, but it was a fun process. And if you want to learn more about that, you can take a boat lofting class. Sometimes they teach them at North House, and it's pretty fun. Yeah. You can also buy plans, though. If you don't want to do that, you can buy plans from a place. A common place that I think has a nice selection is Bear Mountain Boat Works. They sell cedar strip canoe plans. You can also buy like pre-cut molds from them that they will cut for you. Or there's other places too, Chesapeake Lightcraft. There's a place in Cape Cod. I can't remember the name of them right now. Oh, Newfound Woodworks. Newfound Woodworks. I really like those people, actually. They're very nice, nice folks at Newfound Woodworks. So, yeah.
So we have a question here from Taryn Mayer. who says, you said some folks use cedar strips that have a locking sort of mechanism, but you just use straight edge ones. Could you talk about this trade-off more? How do you compensate for the potentially less tight seal between strips?
Yeah, so you know, see a bead and cove, there's like a rounded edge, and then there's a cove on the, and those edges kind of can slide like this, so that as you turn around the turn of the bilge, those coves, those strips stay locked together, and there's no seam. But yeah, you have to order. Well, actually, the first cedar strip canoe I made all my own bead and cove strips by just using a router, a table router, and routing a bead and cove on every strip. But it took so long. It was a big pain in the butt because every strip has to be cut. It has to be touched 3 times. You cut the strip, and then you put the cove on, and then you put the bead on, and it's just a lot. So this way, you know, I just bevel the edges with that little finger plane I was showing you guys. And it's a little bit harder because you don't always get a super tight seam. You kind of have to adjust the bevels. You know, a lot of strips, they need a pretty dramatic bevel in the middle of the boat and then less of a bevel towards the tip of the boat, or vice versa, depending on, you know, where you are in the shape. And it can get tricky. But I'll show you later on if I'm trying to work fast and not get the plank just perfect, which you can do and is a virtue. There's some other tricks you can do. So I'll show you that in a little bit. Yeah.
And you might have touched on this, but what's both the width and the thickness of the strips you're using?
The strips I'm using are 1/4 inch thick and 3/4 of an inch tall. You can use taller strips if you want. The bevels will be more dramatic, like I was talking about before, and then you may end up having to do a little bit more sanding and fairing to get the boat smooth as you get like more sort of multifaceted. You'll have more hard corners to knock off before you sand it, before you glass it. And you can also use slightly thicker or thinner strips, you know, depending on, you know, what you have. If you use thinner strips, you really have to be careful because there's a process that comes after this where you fair the boat, where that's like sanding and planing and getting the boat perfectly smooth and round, and you start to lose some thickness, and you don't want to get too skinny. So 1/4 inch just seems to be a good rule of thumb to keep. You want to make sure you have a decent amount of distance between the 2 layers of fiberglass, and that's what the 1/4 inch is. So.
You have multiple people, Neil Kilcoyne and Jay Larson, wondering about the thumb plane you're using. Neil says he's never used one. He doesn't know what to look for in a good one. Can you share any more details on that? And then also Jay is wondering if you have it handy on you. Can you show it a close-up of it?
You know, I wish I would have brought down here the, you can buy a really cheap thumb plane from Home Depot. They are about 2.5 inches long, and they're black and have a little razor blade in them. You can also buy a fancier thumb plane like this. This is called a squirrel tail thumb plane. This is from Kuhn's. So this does the job. It's a little bit fancier. I also have a bunch of these really cheap little thumb planes, which I didn't bring down here, but that's what I was using in the video, and they're black. And they basically look like this, but they don't have the big squirrel tail on the back of them. They're just something you can hold onto the middle of, and the angle on them is a little bit lower than this. This is actually a bevel down plane. Those cheap thumb planes are bevel up planes that you can get at Home Depot, and they're only like $8 or something. You can also find them on Amazon. Just look for Stanley thumb plane, and they should be like $8 or something like that. They're pretty affordable. Yeah.
Jeffrey Rempel is wondering about lofting the form stations and how the framework is assembled. And then he was also wondering whether the staples penetrate the formwork.
The staples do go into the formwork. Here, I'll turn this around here. So this is the strong back that I had the form set up on. I took most of the forms off, which are down here. You can see the on the edge of the forms here, I put some tape on them so that the glue doesn't stick to the forms. And you can see there are some staple holes. So the staples do go through there. It's really just setting up even intervals on this strong back. So I just got these 2 laminated beams. These are, you know, the kinds of beams that they build a house truss, a floor truss in a house with these days. And I went to the local lumber yard, and they happen to have a bunch of offcuts or a bunch of rejects, because oftentimes these are always custom ordered. Like, there are companies that kind of custom make these, not super custom, but they just, you know, there's enough differences in the sizes. They don't have them standard. But anyway, people who are building a house order a bunch of these. They end up with like 12 extra ones or something, or a couple that aren't quite right, and they give them back to the lumberyard often. And the lumberyard doesn't have anything they can do with them, so they had a pile of them, and I just took 2 for free. But if you don't have that option, there are ways to build a really strong beam. Look up building a box beam out of plywood on the internet, and you may be able to find a way to build a strong back. But then once you have that, you have to figure out a way to make an interval. So these are every 12 inches. And then when I put these blocks at every 12 inches, I had to then put little just sort of ties on, so that this tie is screwed into there, and then it was screwed into the station mold like this. And this allowed me to, you know, just have a station spaced out every 12 inches. You do have to think about, in the middle of the boat, switching sides, because you always want the outside edge of your mold to be the face that is the actual shape of the boat. And so, like, as you're going towards down in one direction, you have this edge. So you have this edge as you're going down this way, and then when you're way over on this side of the boat, you have this edge going down this way. So it's almost always a 12-inch spacing, but in the middle you kind of switch it and change from. So you have to just kind of do that work in your head. So it's a little complicated.
Another quick staple question. Brian Hubert is wondering what the length of the staples is.
I use 9/16. I get the longest staples that I can find is usually about 9/16. 3/4 would be fine. You want to have a staple that you can pull out pretty easily. So it doesn't matter if they're too long, but I have 2 short staples won't work. So 9/16 is what I get.
And then 2 people, John Waddle and Jay Larson, wondering about the beautiful turquoise strip on your canoe. What is that?
Yeah, so this is a boat that I sort of designed myself, and I was just sort of, so okay, the history of this project was last year I built a wood canvas canoe with Jeannie Berkwin and Tom Healy in their wood canvas canoe class, and that was a good learning experience for me in building those kinds of boats. But the Chamber of Commerce had a harder time raffling that boat off last summer, and they wanted something more modern because they've done more modern boats in their raffle in the past. So they asked me if to build like a more modern boat this year. So I said I'll build a cedar-strip, which is more modern. And I thought if I was going to do that, I'm just going to push it and just make it as modern as possible. So I was thinking about hip and modern, and I started thinking about those like epoxy tabletops that you see, you know, where they have like the live edge and they pour epoxy between the live edges on these tables and such. So I thought I'm going to do something like that. And what I did is I just built a mold, which was a long rectangle. It was 16 or is about 18, 19, I think it was 19 feet long, and just with simple 3/8 inch high little like retaining walls all around the mold. And I laid a sheet of fiberglass tape into it. It was a 6 inch wide, 6 ounce thick fiberglass tape. I just laid that out in the bottom of the mold, and then I mixed up a bunch of epoxy and I added some pigment to it, and I poured that pigment that pigmented epoxy over the fiberglass, and got it up to, you know, about 3/8 of an inch thick. And that was pretty much it. Then the next day I ran it through a planer to get it down to a 1/4 inch thick. And if I had more expertise in doing that, I would have tried harder to get exactly 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch thick, so I wouldn't have needed to thickness it at all. But there was some, it's hard, it was just hard to get a perfectly flat surface. So there was, the thing was a little thicker on one side than on the other side, just because just the nature of the space I'm in is not flat at all. So anyway, that's what I did. And if you want to try to replicate that, you should talk to me, because this is a total experiment in trying to do something unique and interesting. And I've learned a few lessons about doing this, and I may do it again, but it was not easy to pull off. And I don't recommend it for your first cedar-strip canoe.
Dennis Strasberg was wondering if you ever have a problem getting the canoe off of the forms due to the glue. And then kind of related, Gary is wondering if you've ever tried using hot glue melt instead of staples.
I've had problems getting the boat off the form, but never because of glue. There are issues getting the boat off the form because of what's called mold lock. And mold lock is when you have boats that have stems like this, where there is a curve that happens down here like this. So the boat is wrapped around this curve, and you have the same thing on some of these molds. This boat has designed with a little bit of tumble home in it, and tumble home is when towards the gunnel, you can kind of see the same thing on this mold, that the boat curves in just a little bit. Probably a little bit more on this next one, but you know, the boat is kind of curving back in a little bit, and this creates something called mold lock, where the boat doesn't want to come off of the form very easily. There's nothing to do with glue. It has to do with just the shape of the molds. And so to get around that, you just have to kind of take set yourself up a building jig, or a strong back that you can get into with screws, and start to take some parts of the boat apart, some parts of the mold apart, before you take the mold off. And you can kind of, what I had to do was basically take this stem out from inside the boat. So I just had to get in there with and it was narrow, but it was still possible. And so I got that stem mold out, and then I could shift the whole boat. And then I took out most of the molds, and then I was able to shift the whole boat forward a little bit, and took the boat off that way. Then I ended up unscrewing most of the rest of the molds after that. But before I took the boat off, I think I only had the molds unscrewed and taken down from about here to about here. And then I just kind of shifted the whole boat forward a couple inches and lifted it off. So, yeah.
So it looks like we've just got 3 questions left on the video. So let's try and knock those 3 out quickly, and then we'll move on, and you can talk a little bit, Josh, about where the canoe process is at now. And then if we have time for any more Q&A after that, we'll
Sure.
revisit that.
Yeah.
So quickly, hot glue melt or hot melt glue rather than staples. Have you experimented with that at all?
I just can't imagine that would really work. I mean, what you use Tite Bond or wood glue to glue the strips together, and hot glue. You could try to hot glue the strips together, but I don't think that the hot melt glue would even stick to the molds all that well. And hot melt glue is not easy to clean off. It's you have to. Anyway, I'd never thought about that. I don't know. I'm never opposed to trying something new, so maybe it would work. But you have that non-stick stuff. You have like this clear plastic tape so things don't stick to the molds, and I'm not even sure the hot melt glue sticks to that either. I'm not sure. So
awesome. And then Neil Kilcoyne is wondering if you have any insight on the positioning for a pair of seats. Typically, how far behind the bow or ahead of the stem do you go?
Yeah, you know, there is some science to that, and I'm not really prepared to talk about that now because I'm not an expert at it. You know, there's some math to it. Ken could maybe answer that question a little bit better than I could. But also with this boat is asymmetrical. So, you know, when boats that are asymmetrical, there's even a little bit more thought that goes into often the forward seat will be a little bit further forward than the aft seat is back. I think that's right. Or I may have messed that up. But anyway, yeah, I'm sorry. If you read a canoe design book, or like, you know, I think they talk about it in a book called Canoe Craft, which is a really good book about cedar strip canoe building, where exactly to put the seats. But there's definitely some different things you want to think about. Also, you want to think about, you know, the weight of the expected paddlers. If you think you are often going to paddle it, you know, with the same person, and you know, if you're a dad and are going to paddle it with your son, you may want to think about if the son's going to be in the front and you're going to be in the back, the weight difference between those two people to keep the boat sort of flat. So.
Awesome, good things to think about. And then the last question for the video, and then Josh, once you answer this question, if you just want to go straight into talking a little bit about where you're at now.
Yeah.
And for everyone else, if you have any questions while Josh continues to talk about that, feel free to again type them into the Q&A or raise your hand. We'll get to as many of them as we're able to. But Josh, the last question on the video: do you prefer belt or orbital sanders, and also what grade of sandpaper?
I start by sanding by hand on the outside of the boat, and I use fairing boards. And I start with 60 grit sandpaper, and I like to use things like, I got to turn this around. I like to use things like this. This is called a fairing board, and I buy sticky backed sandpaper, which comes on a roll, and it usually is this exact width. And this is something that you see sometimes in like auto body applications. It's called a fairing board. So I use this to kind of go as long passes and fair the outside of the boat. This is another fairing board that I have. Same thing, sticky back sandpaper. I also have this one really long fairing board, which is doesn't really not, it's overkill for a boat of this size. But you can buy something like this too, and this has Velcro sandpaper on it. Some people like to use like a belt sanding like this too. I'm not a huge fan of that, but you can do that. So I start by using 60 grit sandpaper and that kind of sanding to get all the ridges off if there's any imperfections in the shape. As I build the boat, I use those that kind of sandpaper with long passes over the boat to get everything even. And then I'll go back and I'll sand with an orbital sander at 120, being very careful to not change the shape anymore after that. I just want to make very even, long back and forth passes with my orbital sander. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. And I've done both. I've gone to 120, or this boat I sanded again, so I right up to 180 on the outside. On the inside, I'll probably just do 120. So I kind of try to bring it to 120 before I glass it. But I start with 60 to get the shape right. Yeah, so. Yeah, so then, you know, a couple other things I thought I'd just show you guys is I just put these together. These are going to be the gunnels of the boat. I did a glue scarf here, so you need, about 17 to 19 foot long piece to turn into a gunnel. And since I didn't have something that long, I did a glue scarf, which you can see right here. This is a long 9-inch long slope. Usually 8 or 9-inch long slope is a good amount of length for a glue scarf. You could probably get by with a shorter one, but and then I clamp them up like this. I thought I'd leave this one clamped. So I have 2 clamps like this to keep the pieces aligned in a parallel line, and then 2 clamps to clamp the actual scarf together. And when I shape these scarves, I just for these 2 pieces that are going to eventually go together, I start with them cut to roughly the length, roughly the triangle shape that I want, and then I put them right next to each other on a bench, and I use just a plane to plane those 2 triangle shaped scarves so that they're flat all the way across the 2 scarves, and that they're like basically perfectly the same between them on the bench. And that's a nice way to make sure that you're going to have a tight joint. Like you can see, there's a pretty tight seam on both sides. There's not really a gap on either side of this thing. And so to pull off a nice tight seam on this glue scarf, you want to lay the 2 pieces. So that's laying this piece and this piece with their triangles kind of both facing up right at the end of the bench, and plane them together, plane them down with a hand plane. After you rough cut them with any kind of saw, I just use a band saw, but then I'm hand planing them to make sure that they're flat across the 2 pieces. So I put a straight edge across the length and make sure that across those 2 triangles, they're both flat all the way across the length of that triangle. So that's how I make a nice sloping glue joint. So yeah, it's hard to get super long pieces to make a gunnel, but get 2 10-foot boards and cut an 8-inch scarf on both of them, and that'll help you out. And then I'd also just thought I'd show you guys, you know, I glassed the outside of this canoe the other day, middle of last week. You can see it's looking pretty nice. I am going to come back and what's going on here? I'm going to come back and sand this. I'm going to come back and sand this whole thing one more time and then varnish the outside. So there's a little bit of runningness happening here. Yeah, so it's close to finished. On the inside, Taryn had asked, you know, talking about little gaps, and since I'm planing these things by hand, sometimes there's a few areas where there's little seams between the strips, and that's also happens if you get sort of wood with irregular grain and just one wants to do a little bow action, and despite your strongest efforts, you just can't overpower the wood grain if it's a little curved. So I just mix up a little sort of like Bondo essentially with epoxy resin and some lightweight fillers. I use a combination of this stuff that's like talc, which is a super lightweight filler, and a little bit of the sanding dust. And then I get something that's a nice color that sort of is a neutral color that approximates the wood and also is super lightweight, because that talc filler is It's very, very lightweight. You don't really want to add weight to this boat if you don't need to, but I just kind of scrape that in with a scraper and fill in any irregular gaps. And now I'm gonna, so that's like to kind of take care of issues where there's, you know, a little bit wider seams. And now I'm gonna come back through and sand all that off with the 120 sandpaper. Also this talc filler sands super easily. So this is just a way to close up any seams before you go with your fiberglass, because you don't want to trap any air between the two layers of fiberglass, because that's going to eventually cause the fiberglass to bubble off. So anyway, that is a little step that I do, which people who are doing bead and cove construction definitely don't do. And if you do a super, super precise job with your beveling your strips with your little thumb plane, you probably don't need to do this, but I think the lumber that I used to build this boat was not always super great. There are some inconsistencies with it. And also I was trying to put these strips on quickly and not, you know, spend an hour on every one. So I ended up with some inconsistencies. And so, yeah, anyway, this is a little shortcut to, you know, have a good looking boat where you won't really notice the seams. Yeah, doesn't really add that much work really, just maybe a slightly bit of extra sanding, but sanding a fair bit anyway, so it doesn't seem like much extra work to me. So, anyway, that is kind of where the project is at right now. After this, I'll finish sanding and glass the inside, and then I will fit little deck plates or breast hooks in the bow and stern of the boat right here. And then I'll put the gunnels on, and then I'll start working on seats and thwarts. And then at some point I'm going to also put an outer stem on, which will be a steam bent piece that will fit on the outside of this and kind of cap all that stuff off. So yeah. Any other questions that happened during that time?
Yeah,
or?
So we have a couple more that have come in. Jay Larson says he jumped on the video just a couple minutes late, but he was wondering about the end of your strips where how you alternate them so that they cross the center line rather than planing them to match up with the strip on the other side. He was wondering if you could speak to why you do that way. He said it looks like a great idea, but he hadn't seen that before.
Okay. Yeah. Well, people call this, I don't know, if you look on, you know, your strip forums on the internet or something, people call this pattern the herringbone pattern. And I think it looks cool. I think it's a lot easier than matching strips down the center line. In terms of, like, I've seen some people basically try to have an imaginary center line down the center of the boat, and then try to have mating strips that come together exactly on the same angle. But when you're trying to do that, you end up making each of these joints basically becomes twice as long. So if you wanted this to meet with its mating strip on the other side, this would turn into a joint that's a lot longer, and there'd be another one right on it that is also that same length. And so in actuality, these little wedges become longer and just become harder to fit. So the shorter you can make this joint, the easier it is to fit, in my opinion, rather than doing that way. There is another way to do it, which is just starting by laying straight strips down the middle of the boat, and you can just put just do one or two straight strips starting off right down the middle from stem to stem, and then build out that way, flanking, stripping kind of straight. But when you do that method, at some point you need to kind of shape some to a football shape anyway. So, you know, boats are a complex shape, and there's different, you know, basically aesthetic choices and strategic choices in terms of fitting that you can make when you strip them out. And And any way you do it, there's going to be a few things that are complicated and need some custom work. The way I do it is I really like to keep my strips pointing up in the bow. I think that things really look nice when a boat has its planks sort of following the shear line, so the strips kind of are all pointing up. And so I bend all my strips up as much as I can, but then at some point, then I had this fiberglass piece which can't bend that way, and so after that I just went to stripping straight. The tricky thing about this is, since I'm switching between like following the shear and stripping straight, I had to put in these wedge strips right through here. So you can see here I'm cutting sort of long tapered wedges in here, and those are the hard long cuts that I'm making on this boat, rather than making them, you know, down in the center line, which is another place where you sometimes end up very long wedges to kind of fit together. Anyway, those are some thoughts on strip patternings. Hope that helps.
Awesome, thank you. And then a couple more material questions. John Waddle is wondering what the black football shape in the bottom of the boat is made out of. And then also Neil Kilcoyne is wondering what type of lumber do you use for the gunnels?
This bottom red thing is something very precious that I got gifted to me. It's a little bit of old redwood, really hard to find. It was salvaged from some old pickle barrels. I was working for a place, and a board member had was like part of the Gedney pickle family, and he had some old salvaged pickle barrel wood. So that is where that redwood is from. It's really hard to find redwood, so it's kind of a unique special piece. You can use other things though. There's nothing saying that you can't use you know, a little bit of walnut or a little bit of, you know, any heavier wood in a boat that is showy or figurey, because you know, it's not going to add that much weight really if you're using just a small amount of it, and you know, aesthetics are important. So these gunnels are actually very heavy. I'm using black locust, which is something that is a really cool wood species that is native to our area, and it is super rot resistant and very hard, and it is not an easy wood to work with, and it's not for the beginner probably, but it has a lot of redeeming qualities that that I like, and so I kind of put up with how problematic it is to work with. It's hard to work with just because it's very hard. It's super dense and hard, and it will dull up your tools pretty quickly. And in some spaces, it kind of likes to like tear more than like shave. So it doesn't always like kind of take to hand tools super nicely, but it really, I think, so historically, people have used black locust for fence posts. They just cut a 4x4 and stick it in the ground, untreated and nothing, and it would last 100 years. This stuff is super rot resistant, and it doesn't really need even to be, you can leave this outside with untreated, like, you know, no oil, no varnish, and nothing on it, and it will, like, you know, become a little weathered, but won't really deteriorate hardly at all. It's super rot resistant. So I thought I would use it for my gunnels because I have some, and kind of see how that goes. Other common species for gunnels are white oak is a really good one. It also has a lot of the same rot resistant qualities that this stuff does, but it's easier to work with than locust. You can use something like ash, which is you know, cheaper and locally available. Ash doesn't quite have the rot resistant qualities that locust or oak do. And also another thing is cherry. People use cherry on gunnels quite a bit, which is locally available and does the job fairly well. So yeah, if you're interested in black locust, there is one person in Wisconsin who is like selling black locust as commercially available lumber, and I would be happy to give you his name. He's like, I think black locust has sort of a niche market that could turn into a bigger market. I think that'd be cool. You know, people have been using black locust locally as a teak alternative. It kind of is a very similar color to teak, and if you leave it untreated, it sort of weathers to look very similar to the way teak weathers when it's sort of just naturally treated. And black locust could be a local alternative to imported, you know, teak from foreign countries. And black locust is it's, you know, you can't really get long nice boards like this, but black locust is super sustainable, and in that it's a legume, it's in the legume family, and it's so you can coppice it and it will just, so you can just kind of cut the tree and it will just regrow from its roots, you know, similar to the way you know, poplar do and things like that. But it just wants to regrow, which from its roots, and having a valuable lumber that's doing that is kind of cool too. So yeah.
Josh, Brian Huberty is wondering about the weight of the fiberglass you use and whether it's a bidirectional weave.
I have used biax weave. For a canoe, that's, you know, a canoe, you don't really need to. So this is just 6-ounce flat weave. I actually have 4-ounce flat weave for the inside, which is something you can do. I knew that this fiberglass strip that I put in there is pretty heavy, just because resin, that dyed fiberglass thing is really, it's mostly resin, and resin is really heavy. So I have been thinking about other ways to shave weight off this boat, since I put in something that I think is really heavy in that resin. So that is why I decided to use 4-ounce for the inside, which should be fine. I've heard about other people doing 4-ounce on the inside and 6-ounce on the outside. So biax is nice. I mean, usually you can't even find biax in 6-ounce. I feel like biax is often like 8-ounce, but biax is probably a little bit easier to use, but I had no problem. This boat is actually a pretty dramatic shape, and I had no problem getting the 6-ounce to lie flat on it. For people who don't understand, biax is basically when instead of being woven with long fibers along the length of the boat and then other fibers this way, biax is that all the fibers are woven at like 45-degree angles to the boat, so the fibers go this way and this way. And you could use a regular, so fiberglass comes in a long sheet, you know, it comes in a sheet in a roll that's 40 inches wide or 50 inches wide. And you could technically just take your flat woven thing and turn it like this, and you'd have biax, but you wouldn't be able to get the 16 inches you need, the 16 feet you need, because you'd be, you know, not covering the boat evenly. So biax is where you have the fibers kind of like sewn at this direction and this direction, and then you can, and it's 16 feet long that direction. So you get your fibers at an angle to the center line of the boat, and that technically, you know, will help you go around curves a little bit easier, because the short fibers, the part of the fiberglass that's going this way, has to take a pretty dramatic bend. And if you are laying them on diagonally, they take a slightly less dramatic bend, and you may be able to get the glass to lay flatter across the curve, but not really that necessary for something like this, but totally an option. Yeah.
Cool. We have just a couple more questions. Neil Kilcoyne has 2 questions about the Gunnels. He's wondering why you like to put the decks on before the gunnels, whether there's a ease of building issue or it's just aesthetics, and then also what technique do you use for producing scuppers in the gunnels? Oop, I think we lost Josh. Let's try and get him back here.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I must have hit something. So here, let me see if I can find something to draw on. Here's a cardboard box I'll draw on. So I put the decks on because I put the decks on first because I find it easier to fit the decks into the tight triangle between the so here's what it is. You have a boat coming together like this, and if you want to put gunnels on first, you're going to have to fit a piece of it's kind of hard for me to do this, a piece of wood in here like this, and a piece of wood in here like this. And figuring out how to like get this joint right here is super hard. It's a long joint that's just not easy to figure out. You're kind of out there shooting in the middle of nowhere. I've done it before, and I've like, gotten this first one that kind of looks this direction. It's like one might be this way, and it's hard to get. It's hard to make it look right. But when you have that same shape, it's pretty easy for me to be able to fit just one piece of deck in there, just like that is just this shape. And then what I do is I will I'll cut some little curve or some shape in there, and then I will make a notch in there for the gunnel to fit into. So the gunnel fits in there like that. And then that's a square shaped end and a much easier thing to fit the inner gunnel into. I hope that makes some sense. And then
makes sense to me, and if it makes sense to me, that's saying something. So yeah, that's helpful. Thanks, Josh.
And then the other thing, I like to cut out the slots for scuppers. When I'm doing scuppers, there's two things you can do. You can just have a long piece like this, and then glue on little things like this. And then once you have those glued on, then you can put them onto the boat like this. That gives you scuppers on the gunnels. The other thing that I do is I will just take a gunnel piece and then I'll cut out little holes like this. And I do that I developed a method for doing that where I take my two gunnels and I hold them next to each other. These are the opposite sides of the boat. And I use a plunge router. I build a special jig for my plunge router. If you guys know what a plunge router is, they have these little bearings, like a bearing collars on the bottom. So there's these little collars that guide where the router plunges down into. So I hold these things together and I build a little jig that is sort of like makes these 4-inch long openings at regular intervals. So maybe be like 4 inches of nothing and then a 4-inch hole. And I'll make that jig just as wide as two gunnels together, and then I'll just plunge in with my plunge router and cut out like two even spaced, two even thickness holes like that. So yeah.
That's cool. And then so it looks like we just have one more question. I think this will be a good one to wrap things up with, and then we'll turn things back over to Sarah to wrap things up. But Catherine Sundam is wondering if you can recommend a small project for a beginner, I assume for someone interested in getting into boat building.
If you want to get into boat building, a good beginner project might be to build a plywood boat, and a decent plywood boat might be the nutshell pram, which is, you know, similar to the Norwegian pram that we build here at North House sometimes, but you can build the whole thing out of plywood and it's joined together with epoxy. That's a nice boat. That's an easier for beginners because it doesn't have stems. You don't really have to do any steam bending, but you do get to think about how to, you know, plane planks. So with that, you'll need a decent like block plane to plane the edges of your plywood planks so that the next plywood plank will fit onto it, and you get to build, you know, a nice form in the middle, like thus a strong back. But it's only an 8-foot long boat, so it's not super hard. Anyway, yeah.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. This was a lot of fun. Lots of great questions from everyone and an excellent chance to get some up close looks at the canoe in progress. I'm sure we'll all be excited to see photos of the finished boat, and I'm sure Josh will be excited to share them when it's all done. I just wanted to say that there will be more programs like this going on the rest of the week. Feel free to check out the North House homepage at northhouse.org to see the schedule. Tomorrow's Lunch and Learn will be with Robert Burns, one of our blacksmithing instructors, and he'll be talking all about tool sharpening, which is a great follow-up to today's boat building webinar. And that one will be happening live over on Instagram. So head to the North House homepage to find out how to join those. Thanks again, everyone. You want to just say bye, Josh?
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Sorry it was so long. I guess I got a lot of good questions. I didn't even realize that we had gone way over an hour here, but hope you guys found it interesting. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me with questions. You can find my email at North House, or my webpage is manywatersboats.com. Manywatersboats.com. You can find me and email me there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I did go ahead and put your website in the chat box, Josh, as well as your North House email if you want to follow up with questions. We also posted a link in the chat box to the YouTube video of the video that we showed earlier of Josh adding a plank to the boat. So feel free to check that out if you'd like to watch that video again. All right. Thanks, everyone. Until next time. See you later.
Bye.